Well, according to recent research that's out of the United States, more than 40% of the American workforce will be freelancers by the year 2020, and permanent employees will be harder to find. Now, this creates an interesting challenge for companies looking to develop their employee engagement initiatives and find ways to ensure they're going to be committed to the long-term success of the business. In this segment, we're taking a look at why it's important to have engaged employees and strategies that business owners and managers can apply. My guest, of course, still with me, Tandisizwe, Mahlutshana, Jessica Hubbard, and Gavin, Symanowitz-Founder of feedbackrocket.com, Kevin Liebenberg-MD of Actuate. Thanks for joining the conversation. I'll just start off with you, Tandisizwe. Of course, in the current environment where people want more freedom, companies still want committed long-term employees. There is almost opposing forces working out here.
Look, it's true. I think if you look at the current environment, I don't think there's a better time now to actually engage your employees more effectively. If you look, for example, at the economic recession, employees are demanding higher salaries. The economics is slowing down. Therefore, they can't afford those higher salaries, and employees just simply stay away or strike, and then companies have to deal with low productivity or low productivity levels. And I simply don't believe that engaging your employees, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more. I simply don't believe that engaging your employees is simply taking them to a restaurant or those team building sessions. I think you want to talk about real issues that affect
their day-to-day job.
Absolutely. Not only their jobs, but the survival of the actual company, because if it is threatened, then everybody who works in it is threatened. And I mean, it's not a South African phenomenon as we see in the mining sector and other sectors as well. Currently, teachers in England and in Wales are on strike over salaries and over workload. So it's not a South African thing, it's happening all over the world. And simply, if there is a breakdown between engaging your employees more effectively to talk about what matters for the survival and the success of the company, then you're simply missing the link.
Yeah. Kevin, you spend a lot of time in internal marketing. What's the current thinking around engaging with employees more effectively?
Well, I think you've got to look at the company as a whole. And first of all, I think it's worth saying that if you run your company well, then possibly you don't have to spend so much time thinking of employee engagement initiatives. So what we see happening, though, is where certainly communication events start coming to their own is, for example, strategy. Research shows that less than 10% of your employees understand your business strategy. So we're talking about 90% of your entire employee force are unguarded missiles. In that case, it makes a lot of sense to start communicating your strategy as you would advertise and market one of your products or services in the above the line or consumer space. So we assume, and I think we're probably correct, that most big companies spend more on catering than they do on communicating their strategy, as an example.
So would you agree that there's too much focus on parties, too much focus on kind of out of work events, as opposed to focusing in on the task at hand and perhaps communicating that long-term goal?
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of companies almost equate team building with employee engagement. Where if you go out to, as you said, end of year function, or you go walking on coals or something, you create a team culture that is supposed to drive the business
climb
forward.
Kilimanjaro. We just did that at CNBC.
But there's very little research to support that actually that leads to long-term engagement, better relationships between people that ultimately drive the business forward. I think if you really want to drive employee engagement, it's about firstly understanding the real issues that people are having within the business, giving them a safe and effective mechanism in order to air their views and to put forward solutions in order to resolve those issues that they're talking about. Because most of the time, employees themselves know better than anyone what needs to be done in order to move the business forward.
Kevin, you mentioned strategy. Wouldn't many in a business argue that strategy is only for the C-suite, for the management level? And if you are trying to communicate strategy, how would you do that from top downwards?
Well, I think, first of all, I think that perhaps the risk of offending anyone, the less progressive companies would say that strategy is only for the C-suite. And certainly the development of the broad strategy belongs there. But once that's been developed, and there are many progressive companies who bring their employees into the loop, I guess there's two sides to that story. But how you would communicate that, and certainly how we drive that process, is by looking at it from first of all, you need to strip it down to something that is understandable to everyone. So get the lowest common denominator, not too dumbed down, but certainly a version that everyone should be able to understand. And then actually develop it as if you were developing an advertising campaign. So develop a concept that relates to your business and to the strategy and the strategic imperatives that you're putting in place. Make it interesting, make it engaging. Spend a similar amount of money on the actual campaign than you would on communicating or advertising something in the open market. It's awfully very frustrating for us where we get someone who says, well, it's only for staff. And the reality is your staff are more inoculated than the external environment. They're already a little bit more cynical. So do it in a way that is interesting, intriguing, engaging, simple to understand, just following a marketing process, typically speaking.
So it's advertising to your staff.
It is, yeah. And choosing what you advertise.
And just to add to that, there's increasing evidence that if an employee understands how their contribution or their job contributes to the longer term success of the organization, that drives employee engagement as well. So part of strategy would be to actually enable managers to talk to the employees to say, look, this is the job that you're doing, this is why you're doing it, this is why it's important, and this is how it's actually contributing to the long-term success of the organization. And that can have a big impact in terms of employee engagement.
But we talked about this broader theme that's taking place globally right now, where you've got people wanting to be independent. They want to be freelancers. They want to work where they, from home. They want to be flexible. So how does that fit into employee engagement? How does that affect companies right now who want commitment and employees to be kind of in the same building, perhaps?
Well, I certainly don't think engagement is an issue of having to be physically present. So employee engagement is defined as a enhanced emotive and cognitive link to your organization that makes you more willing to give discretionary effort. So that's what you're looking for, is highly engaged employees give discretionary effort. If we find, for example, in an organization that freelancing, working off-site, all of those new things that technology now allow, that doesn't preclude the fact that, in fact, that can contribute to the engagement issue. You probably then just have to look more cleverly at how you communicate with those people. You still have to have the human elements. Even if someone is off-site, they still, a lunch with your manager goes a very long way. And also, I think what you have to look at as well, just like any marketing campaign, is you segment your target market. So you would have people who are working off-site, you have people working on-site. You would perhaps approach them in a different way and how you communicate what you market to them.
It's an interesting matter that you bring up, Sam. I mean, if you look at the Auditor General's report, it talks about consultants who used to work for certain companies and decided to go out on their own. And perhaps the thing that was most inviting was the amount of money they would make if they went consulting as opposed to working for a specific company. So how does communicating finances in employee engagement, how much does that matter as opposed to things like strategy and things like that? Because I mean, one may simply believe that for one to be fully committed to a company may not necessarily be to understand the strategy and where the vision and the mission of the company is, but simply because they pay me well.
Okay, I think there's ample research to support the fact that there's hygiene factors and there are motivational factors with regards to engaging employees. Salary is a ticket to the game. So even though we might even say, if you pay me more, I'll be more productive, the reality is, and lots of research shows, especially in a knowledge worker environment, the opposite actually occurs. So when we incentivize people who are knowledge workers in a financial sense, often the output, the quality of the output declines. And that study has been replicated a number of times.
What's the reason behind that?
Well, as I say, salary is the ticket to the game. So you're not going to go to another company necessarily. Some might, but mostly you'll go for a salary increase. Once you're there, there are a whole host of other factors that are going to determine whether you're engaged or whether you're not. So certainly a ticket to the game issue, sure. But your engagement strategy will fail miserably and probably bankrupt you if you're just going to pay people more and more and more.
Do you agree? And how do you also build that into the context of what Tandisizwe is saying in terms of advertising, communicating their value, perhaps financially?
I mean, I think the whole issue of pay is overrated as well. People think that people leave companies because of pay. And in fact, in most exit interviews, if you ask people, why did you leave? They'll say it's because I've been paid a higher salary or whatever. Most of the time, that's not the truth. There's other issues that are actually more important that are causing them to think of leaving in the first place. But in an exit interview, you're not going to say what the real issues are because it's a difficult conversation. There's no real upside. You don't want to burn your bridges. So you just say, well, I'm getting paid more at the other company, and so I'm going to leave, and everyone's happy. So it's almost a smokescreen to other issues that are actually more important underneath. Having said that, though, I mean, pay is important, but it's not only the amount of pay. So, for example, transparency of pay is also often a big issue within companies, and that's not related to how much I'm getting paid, but how the actual pay structure is organized or structured within the organization. There's favoritism within the organization or within pay structures, and not necessarily that there is favoritism, but there's a perception of favoritism. And very often it's communication that is at fault, and that's what companies need to work on in order to address the issue.
Do you need to build those ladders for people so they can see, if I achieve that, I will be earning that?
Absolutely. I think some kind of career progression, talent management, all of those things are absolutely necessary. So, and that often comes down to the quality of management and leadership.
Yeah.
In your work with companies, you mentioned sort of campaigns directed to internal and staff. What are some of the platforms that you would recommend, the tools, the actual mediums that you would use?
Okay. Almost without exception, and there'd be a rare exception in this case, is manager as a medium. The primary medium, and most of us will agree with this unless we have a terrible manager, is we'd rather hear about something from our manager. So a large part of our campaigns, almost without exception, are around equipping the manager to have a consistent, if possible and if appropriate, entertaining and engaging conversation or session with their manager.
So it's personal interaction.
Personal interaction's always vital, where possible, and it's always awesome if you can get a CEO, for example, to have something we call a brown bag break, have lunch with 10 randomly selected employees from all levels and just engage. It does a world of difference. And then, of course, there are the other elements that you would have. You would try to have some kind of a digital presence. There are things you can do on email. We generally try not to rely on email because email is overused and people tend to discard it. And then, like any other campaign, activations, brochureware, posterware, environmental signage, where possible and where it's, again, it's appropriate, incentives or